Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is actually my first video of 2024, and yes, Happy New Year to all of you. I think everyone who has been watching my videos this far, or even if you're a new viewer, I still thank you for watching. And in this video, I'll be talking about this lens right here. It's one of my favorite lenses. It's the Canon RF 15-35mm f2.8 lens. It's not a review, just as usual, but it'll just be about my opinion based on how I use this lens, in case it might just, give you a second or a third opinion, or just, maybe benefit some of you guys based on how you shoot as well. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon RF 15-35mm f2.8 L IS USM lens. That's a real mouthful name to say, but it's actually a really good lens, and because it's been out for quite a while now, there are a lot of reviews out there, and in this video it's actually just a video based on my opinion, based on, my thoughts on how I use this lens, how I shoot with it, things like that, in case it might actually help some of you out. And as usual, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. The first one, I'll be talking about the ergonomics and the operational side of things, leading down into the image quality, and then into my conclusion about this lens. So let's first start with the ergonomics and the operational side of things. Well, this lens is built like a tank. Yes, it does feel, well, in my opinion, it does feel a little bit plasticky compared to the EF counterpart, like the 16-35 f2.8 and the f4, well, the 16-35 f2.8 Mark III L USM. It's still another mouthful name to say, but anyway, those lenses do feel a little bit more tough and a little bit more solid. That being said, this is still a really good plastic construction, and it still feels solid. Just I wish it's as solid as this lens, at least with the feeling of it. But I know that the engineering wise, it's actually a pretty good and solid lens, because this lens also went through quite a few storms, whether it's sandstorms and also heat waves and also downpour, things like that. This lens has seen it all, and it is still pretty much in a good shape and functions quite nicely. Talking about weather, let me first touch a little bit more on the weather sealing. Yes, this lens has weather sealing. It has a really nice durable weather sealing. Yes, this actually freaks me out a little bit that it's externally zoom, because with the EF counterparts, they're all internal zoom. And with those, I was able to, feel more relaxed shooting in harsh environments with those lenses. But with this lens, I did feel a little bit of, unsure at some point. But after shooting a while with this lens through different conditions, it is a well designed and engineered lens, and yeah, it's quite nice. But it's also quite tough in the way that if you do shoot a lot in, let's say, downpour, even the ultra wide angle lenses, the F counterparts, they will slowly build up a little bit of fog or mist in front of the element, the front element. Whereas with this one, you still can keep on shooting, and the fog or the mist will just not really build up that easily in front of the element. Of course, this lens, I do have this filter in front. I don't usually like putting filters in front of the lenses, but this is one of the more expensive B+W clear filter that still allows the front element of the lens to perform to its full potential, and doesn't cut on any quality. So if you do want to get filters, I do highly recommend getting one of those professional filters as well. I personally use the B+W ones. So yeah, anyway, that's it about the weather sealing. Now moving on to the other build quality. This lens obviously has a metal lens mount, which is actually quite nice, but it's also a really nice, solidly built and comfortable lens to use. So these rings are actually very nice and smooth to operate, and they don't get stuck very easily. The only nitpick I do have, and this is very subjective, is again, I'm comparing it to the EF counterparts, whether it's the 2.8 or the f4 versions, because I come from those lenses before coming to the mirrorless system from Canon. So those are the only lenses that I'm sure a lot of people will relate to, at least. So that's why I'm actually comparing it to those lenses as well. Anyway, those lenses, they also feel very smooth, but it's a little bit more stiff kind of smooth, which is what I like. And if you're working a lot in, let's say, cold environments, let's say, Northern Europe during winter, where you're wearing gloves, you kind of like that stiffness as a little confirmation. It's kind of like when you're working in the cold weather with the gloves on, you also like buttons that are either clicky or some sort of like really deep mushy buttons that you feel the confirmation. That goes the same with the lenses. It's very smooth and it's very nice, don't get me wrong. Just in harsh environments, like super cold environments where you're working with gloves, you also want the feeling of not wanting to twist these rings by accident. But that's just probably a very specific case to, you know, how I shoot as well. Moving on to the focusing ring. This is focusing by wire lens. So the focus ring naturally don't have that kind of like weight to it when you actually rotate. It's very buttery smooth, don't get me wrong. And it's still very precise. But because there's not weight like with the EF counterparts, when you're actually shifting the focus, you're actually literally moving the glass inside as well. And you do feel that weight, and you don't anymore. And to a person who is used to that, this is something I personally might have to get used to. Well, definitely have to get used to, but you know, I just wish it would just be a little bit more resistance. Like there would be a bit more resistance to it, things like that. But that's just minor nitpicks, and it's something that if you're just starting out with this lens, you'll definitely, you know, use this lens as a benchmark. But because I came from the EF, that is kind of like my benchmark at some point, so just keep that in mind. And moving on to the next point is this control ring. Now, I personally thought it was a cool idea when the first EOS R came out with all the L lenses, that it had the control rings and everything. It's gonna make the workflow very fast. But to be quite frank with you, cameras like the R3, R5, R6, which is behind me, things like that, they all have more than enough dials on the camera body, and also more than enough customizable buttons that personally I find this ring useless and haven't set it to anything, because in order to activate using these features, I also have to press half shutter in the same time. I do understand the safety mechanism behind it, that you're not going to be, you know, twisting this ring by accident, but in the same time, just by using these dials on the back end, on the top of the camera, it just makes it much faster in terms of operating the whole shoot, you know. So yeah, there is that. The lens filter size or filter thread is 82 millimeters. It is still on the common side, but it's nowhere near as common as the 77 millimeter. So some of the accessories will be a little bit more expensive, but in the same time, when you're already spending this much money on this particular lens, spending a bit more on the accessories might not really matter that much. Anyway, that's just what I think. And now onto the other side of the lens, which is the focusing system. The focusing system on this lens is actually really nice. I really love the reliability of the focusing mode or the focusing system in this lens, because it rarely hunts. Actually, I haven't experienced this lens hunting at all. So with the EF counterpart, there were like times when it would just kind of hunt a little bit when the patterns in the frame gets a bit complex or a bit more complicated, or if the subject is behind a certain complex pattern or like behind certain branches, tree branches, then the lens will definitely hunt just a tiny bit, just a tad. But with this lens, it rarely hunts, and I really love it, because, you know, like, I'm always sure that my shots will definitely be in focus every time I focus with this lens. And talking about focusing, again, the tracking on this lens is actually pretty good. Yes, it's an ultra wide, it's not a hard job, but when you're shooting portraits with complex patterns, of course, that is also to do with the camera the focusing system in the camera itself as well. But just comparing, you know, adapting the EF counterpart onto the EOS R, EOS R5, R6 as well, I definitely noticed that it hunts way less, well, rarely hunts, and it tracks the portraits, well, at least the faces, much better as well with the RF version. I can't say the same for the 14mm, well, the f4 version of the ultra wide, because I don't have that lens, but at least with the f2.8 version, it's definitely, you know, really good and really reliable. So yeah, there is that. And now onto another feature that most people don't really talk about, but personally I love this. It's not really a feature, but I wish that they would also implement this in this on these rings, is adding that extra resistance to these buttons right here. This really matters a lot because I usually travel to places with a lot of gear, simply because there's my YouTube gear, there's also my professional gear, and the lenses for my YouTube cameras, and also for, you know, the camera that I use professionally, and also other behind the scene cameras like GoPros and my Fuji cameras, the X-T3, X-T4, blah blah blah, and also the Insta360 X blah blah blah. You get the idea. Then if you're having a bag full of equipment, usually when you slide in the lens, and if the lenses have, you know, normal switches which has kind of like just enough resistance for you to feel the switches, it tends to get switched around in the bag quite often. And often what I notice with my EF lenses, at least the ultra wide lenses, the 16 to 35 millimeter versions, is the switches would get, you know, switch around, like the manual focus or to autofocus, or from autofocus to manual focus, stabilization on or off, things like that. Whereas with this one, it just remains in the position where I last left it, which is really nice, because then I, like, you know, it's one thing less for me to worry about every time I take the lens out and use the lens. So that's pretty great. And yeah, now over to the image quality. Well, the image quality of this lens, there's actually very little to talk about because a lot of things are really nice. Let me first start with the bad things, because there are still some bad points, but it's actually very minor. So with ultra wide angle lenses, yes, it's gonna be kind of soft in the corners, but I'm talking about like really far edges in the corners, and there is definitely vignetting and barrel distortion as well. But the barrel distortion is not too extreme, thankfully. And also the softness in the corners, if you're shooting a lot of portraits like I do, it definitely is pleasing. But what's not so pleasing is the vignetting, but the vignetting is kind of gone after you know, correct the lens, whether internally in the camera or using Lightroom to correct the lens. It's really just fine. Yeah, it's not as extreme as, let's say, the 16mm f2.8 pancake lens. Now that is a real extreme case of vignetting, and also the 14 to 35mm f4, that's also a very extreme case of vignetting. Whereas with this one, it's not an extreme case. It's definitely, if you don't want to correct the lens, you still can work with the vignetting, especially for portraits. So it really depends on what you shoot. But if you're shooting cityscapes, landscape, things like that, then you definitely want to correct the vignetting for sure. Otherwise, the corners, yes, they are soft, and there are definitely lenses within the same price range that are also ultra wide. Some could actually be a tiny bit cheaper that are sharper around the corners, but from the center to almost the very corner, this lens performs really nice and sharp. And when you stop it down to f4, because I was talking about the f2.8, sorry that I didn't mention that earlier, but if you're stopping down to f4 and above, that's when the corner becomes really sharp. And it peaks at around between f9 and f14, depending on the condition and the lighting that you shoot in. So that's actually quite nice. And talking about the lighting, this lens handles contrast control really nicely. So regardless of lighting, whether it's direct light or kind of like artificial lights or harsh light, soft light, this lens definitely handles contrast control really nicely, and the sharpness also stays very consistent as well. So that's actually quite nice. The lens itself also handles flaring very nicely, and if you're into shooting kind of like a sunstar effect, like shooting against the sunlight and you have that sunstar effect, then this lens definitely renders really nice and elegant looking sunstar effect, which is something that I really love coming out, you know, to this lens. But of course, most Canon L lenses, whether it's RF or EF versions, they definitely produce really good sunstar effects. So that's something that, you know, Canon has been consistently keeping up with, and it's something that I personally really like. And the flaring control is also quite nice. There is flaring. If you want to introduce flare into the image, you can, but when flare does occur, it's actually very nice and very natural looking. It's not going to be distracting, huge kind of flare. It'll just be very minimal, but very pleasing and elegant looking kind of flare. The rendition of the details on this lens is also very nice, and despite being sharp, it's also not too sharp in a way that's going to be distracting, because some lenses are too sharp that a lot of unwanted details get rendered in there. But with this lens, it's super sharp, but somehow it also knows not to over sharp certain details, if that makes sense. But yeah, there is that. Otherwise, the chromatic aberration on this lens is actually very well controlled. There is chromatic aberration though, but only like if you're shooting at extreme contrasty situations, and even then you will still just see like super minimal amount of chromatic aberration that you can just really ignore if you don't want to use the internal camera correction, nor the ones in the Lightroom or other editing software that you might have. So yeah, there is that. And now on to the conclusion. So this lens so far has been a pretty easy lens to talk about. A lot of things on this lens has been, you know, very positive, aside from just the minor vignetting and the minor softness in the corners and the build quality that, you know, I personally find that the EF counterparts definitely feels a bit more solid, things like that. But those are just minor, just nitpicks for me. Maybe I'm just being too picky, I don't know. And yeah, it's been a pretty good lens. It's really reliable. It's really like very nice to work with, and also very efficient to work with as well. And the images, the colors, the renditions that comes out of this lens is really, really nice. And when you work with this lens, you will just fall in love with the image quality of this lens. With the price tag, is it worth it? I would say it's definitely worth it. It looks really expensive, and it is actually a lot of money if you just look at the price by itself. But if you get to work with it and see the quality of the lens, and also like all the other benefits that the RF system brings to you, you'll definitely see why this lens is still worth, you know, considering and maybe even trying or even buying this lens. So yeah, overall I do recommend it. But if you're not going to be shooting a lot at f2.8, and also if you're not a kind of person who likes, you know, this lens size, then a 14 to 35mm f4 would be better option. The optics on that lens is still very, very good. Now, I don't own the lens, but I've seen image samples, both RAW and JPEGs. That lens definitely produced really great results as well if you're not into, you know, using f2.8 and only shoot from f4 and above. So, and it's also much lighter, therefore you can actually carry other gear with it as well, so, and also cheaper. But for the rest of us who want to use f2.8 with the ultra wide angle lenses, because you still can shoot portraits and also you still can have that really nice dreamy, well not dreamy, but really nice bokeh rendition at least, then the 15 to 35 f2.8 lens is still a very good option to consider. But yeah, otherwise that's it for this video. I thank you all very much for watching. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free. The link is down in the description section below. It's on my website. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. My online courses are also available on my website now. More courses are definitely coming. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And otherwise, I thank you all very much again for watching. Happy New Year. Stay safe. Have fun shooting. Till next time. Bye for now.